Hi,
Hey,
Cruz. Hi, thank you so much for doing this interview for our Choral Artists of Carmel concert. And I'm so excited to speak with you and learn more about who you are as a composer and learn more about this incredible piece that Celestiani Jordan is going to be singing. And
thank you.
so I'll first just give a little bit of an introduction.
Great.
I know that you are an educator and a composer, and you're on staff at the UC Santa Cruz and also Cal State Monterey Bay. And I think you have some other studios that you also teach privately composition.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, you have a quite an impressive list of compositions. You've written opera, chamber music, children's opera, choral music, instrumental music, harp concerto, two
Yeah.
orchestral works, and then there are many, many pieces for solo voice, as well as electronic media. And I know that in 2022 at UC Santa Cruz, they performed your children's opera, My Head is Full of Colors.
Correct. Yeah.
So that's just a little bit about you. And anyway,
Well, thank you for that introduction, Robin. That's nice to remember all the work that I've produced over the years. It's I generally don't think about that, put it on, a CV or on your bio, but then and you kind of go about your daily life as a composer, thinking about the current thing you're working on and what you hope to work on in the future. So it's kind of fun to have that little uh, bird's eye view.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's fascinating to me as a musician and a conductor to learn more about the composer if that information is available, because then I think then we all feel closer to the music, and in particular, in many of your pieces, what's I think distinctive, or for me, what I'm hearing is that if you're writing a chamber piece, each uh, each line, whether it be the cello or a flute, has a unique voice of its own. It's very independent in its meaning, and
Mm.
I don't really know how to put that into words, but it's very distinctive about your whole body of compositions.
Well, that's interesting insight. I hadn't really thought about it in those exact terms, although I will say that I do think about trying to make every part interesting for the player. So very often when I'm composing, I'm thinking about the musicians that I'm writing for or for the potential musicians. And unless it's a fairly large piece, or obviously, not everybody can have a moment, right? In an orchestral piece, we tend to group instruments together just out of necessity, really. But in chamber music, I do spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, what's the timbre of this instrument? What range are we in? What color does that provide? And also, how does this instrument, how are they going to add um, both timbrally and also emotionally to whatever the piece is about for me?
Well, I definitely hear that the
Cool.
instrument has this color and timbre, as you say, that's unique to your vision. And in our concert, when our audience hears Celestiani sing, it's I just think it's an extraordinary piece for
Thank you.
the voice to be so expressive, and then to have the organ used in the way that maybe you're trying to explain it. I didn't really, it just has this unique voice and sound to it. And so not only is the texture, but just the whole sound and the presentation of the instrument is then brought to the forefront somehow. And then the same thing with Celestiani, who is such a fabulous singer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I do think that that's sort of a responsibility that we do take, a lot of composers, sort of after the now long past innovations at the beginning of the 20th century, but I think they still resonate today with composers like Debussy and Stravinsky, where you just really associate specific lines with specific instruments, right? I mean, it's just the very high bassoon part at the beginning of Rite of Spring, or English horn in one of the nocturnes, uh, and it's just this idea that, yeah, you want to really be sensitive to that, and not to knock Bach, because I love Bach, but it's and the Brandenburg concertos do that, by the way. So it's not all Bach pieces, but in some Bach pieces, I do feel like there's a universality in the way of writing, where you could arrange it for different instruments. You could take this fugue, you could play it on harpsichord, you could play it on organ, you could arrange it for strings, and it would sound good in all these different settings. It has a sort of universal quality to the way that the music is constructed. In a way, it's almost built on an abstract level, and it exists in this abstract level. Um, and and although I do a lot of arranging, actually, of my pieces for other instruments, still we try to, I think we as modern composers, we try to be really sensitive to specific qualities, and the expressive possibilities of every instrument, right? So that it does have that sense of inevitability.
Yeah.
It's really, I can't really imagine this with another instrument. The truth is that you usually can. I mean, digging back, Ravel's a great example of that, right? You hear some of his piano music, this is a perfect piano piece. And then he arranges it for orchestra, and it's like, oh, it's a perfect piece for orchestra too. So it is possible to take music and rework it in a way that still makes it sound like it really lives in that particular instrumental combination. Um, but it does take some doing. It's great to hear you hear that you're hearing that. That's wonderful.
Well, I do have a list of questions.
Okay, cool.
The first one is, what are your earliest memories as a musician?
So that's interesting, because I actually came to music fairly late. My which is bizarre, because my family's filled with musicians. Um, my grandmother's parents, and we'll come back to my grandmother. This is my maternal grandmother. Her parents were both conservatory trained musicians, and they all were from Guatemala. And in Guatemala City, there was a conservatory in the early 20th century. There still is, but it was there when my great grandparents were young, and they studied, and they studied classical music. And when they got married, and they went on a little mini tour through Central America, giving concerts, variety shows, combinations of opera scenes, zarzuelas, which are like Spanish comic operas, songs, chamber pieces. People would do poetry readings. And this was in horse and buggy time. They didn't get in their van and drive around Central America. They were on horse and buggy, going through Central America and performing in different towns. And it was like a 2-year tour, I think. It was a long tour. Um, and the history of that's really interesting, which maybe we can get into later. But just that little example, just to say that music, and sort of what we think of as classical music, was sort of in my family my whole life. So my grandmother listened to a lot of music. I had uncles, my mom's brothers and my mom, they were all musical. They had bands growing up. They were more into popular styles. Um, and my mom's orientation was the voice. And so when I was very young, she had asked me to sing along with her. and we'd try singing different songs, and I would always sing out of key. And so I've never had a really sharp connection between my ear and my voice. It's always been something that I struggled with. And eventually I overcame it and went to music school and all that stuff. But it, it's like anything else, right? Some people, even professional singers, they just are really in tune all the time, and then some folks struggle. And it's just there's a range of that. And my mom's conclusion was that I wasn't musical, and so I didn't. She didn't really go much from there, and so I didn't really have any lessons or anything when I was a kid. Um, and I wasn't really that interested either. I was more interested in cars and building things out of Lego and stuff like that. Had a breakdancing phase. And when I was 16, I came around to music, but through the rock and roll lens. So I was a typical sort of angry teenager, and I was really attracted to the sort of aggressiveness and catharsis that you get in sort of hard rock. And so I, got a guitar and I started learning how to play things. But very quickly, I was interested in other sounds. So very quickly, I started becoming interested in flamenco. I started becoming interested in classical guitar. I became fascinated with notation, even though nobody had ever taught me notation. I was like really interested in how it worked. And so when I was 17, 18, I went to Cabrillo College and started taking music classes. And at that point, I taught myself notation, and I started writing little introductions and other little things from the guitar and from the piano on staff paper, totally incorrectly because I didn't know what the rules were, right? But I was fascinated with this idea of, wow, I can write something and I can write it down and then it's somehow then preserved. And I love that. I also wrote a lot of poetry when I was young, actually, when I was a little kid. I was really into poetry. And so I wrote a lot of poetry in grade school and in middle school. So yeah, that's really when I started getting into music. And so my sort of earliest memories of composing were fairly recent. I mean, not fairly recent, but 16, 17, where I was just sort of working my way through finding ways to write down what I was playing.
Wonderful. I love that. Yeah. And what is your musical education? You sound like you were self-taught. You were at Cabrillo.
Yeah, I was self-taught in the beginning, but then I went to Cabrillo and I was going to study horticulture because I just thought, hey, that sounds fun. And then I took a music class and I really liked it and I was good at it. So I took another music class. And then a few years later, I was just all I was taking. So I spent a lot of time at Cabrillo because I did not have that musical education as a kid. And so I took piano lessons, I sang in choirs, I did all the music theory sequence, I did jazz studies, electronic music, recording. Um, and then I transferred to UCSC and got my bachelor's degree there, and then also got a master's degree there in composition.
Wow. Yeah, well, I know when I was in high school, my father insisted that I go to the junior college for music theory, and I joined, that's the first time I did the Handel's Messiah,
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
and I ended up teaching in the junior community colleges, and they're the best bargains in the United States.
Oh, it's ridiculous, especially
Incredible.
if you have one like Cabrillo, which is a really good school. I know
Yeah,
there are others that are great. I just don't personally know, but some community colleges have really robust music programs, and
yeah,
it really is a bargain. And also, it's a great place to learn music without the stress of I have to graduate, I have to get through this, I can't afford an extra year. I can't afford to mess up. And the truth is that music education is really hard. And it's very common for people to need to retake classes. And it's a really great way to do it and have fun, I think.
yeah. You're very fortunate that you realized your incredible opportunity to,
For me, it was a matter of necessity. So it was purely financial because we couldn't afford to have me go straight to a 4-year school, but it worked out perfectly. I mean, and also just being in Santa Cruz was sort of a happenstance. because we had been living in Texas before then in Houston. So yeah, I had a lot of luck. You know how life is, a lot of happy accidents.
Yeah. And then what inspires you to compose? You've already.
Yeah, so a couple of different things. One is commissions, right? So that's a big thing. Or requests. Somebody, I have a friend say, "Hey, I want a piece." Recently, I had a friend of mine who plays viola, Polly Milan. She said, "Hey, I got a new viola. I want a piece for it." We wrote a piece. Sometimes there'll be a commission of some sort, like the children's opera. So I was a composer in residence, and so those were all commissions. Um, so, prompting from a musician or a musical group is one big thing. And then other times it's just an idea that I have that I think is a good idea and that I want to see realized. So right now, for example, one idea I've had for a long time is to have a sort of multicultural choral piece that is sort of a call for peace and that has sort of wise words from people throughout history from lots of different cultures that sort of speak to our better selves and call on call unto all of us to be good to each other and just as a show of unity, right? And so this is an idea that I've been kind of toying with for a long time, and I'm in this sort of pre-composition stages right now where I'm assembling texts, reading texts, and trying to figure out like what poets I would include in this. Um, and um, and so that's another example of why I might do something. I might just have an idea and think, hey, this is a good idea, so I'm going to figure out how to make this happen, and then I get into the pre-compositional work.
Wonderful. And what is your compositional process? You've already been talking about it some, but
Sure. So if it's a vocal piece, it always starts with the text, although the idea might not start with the text. So, for example, I'm the artistic director for one of the Santa Cruz Chamber Players concerts, the one in March. And in that show, I forward a proposal that included a piece that I wanted to write for a tenor, viola, and piano. And I had the idea for the concert before I knew what the text was going to be. So then I chose the text, which is a poem by Lawrence Hope, who's a late 19th, early 20th century poet. Um, and then once I picked the piece, the poem to set, I spent a lot of time with the poem, reciting it, feeling the rhythm, um, trying to figure out if it has a structure. Does it group itself into different big sections that will then guide me to the structure of my piece? Um, if it's a vocal piece, very often I'll either sit at the piano and sing and try to find the melodies that way, or I'll just sing away from the keyboard and just find melodies that way. Um, and so my process with vocal music is very much centered around vocalizing myself. It's very physical in that sense. Um, for the rest of the music, the instrumental parts, I usually sit at the piano, and it's a combination of improvisation and composition. So maybe I'll have a gesture in mind, and I'll find the notes that I have in my mind for that gesture, or I'll improvise in various ways. Could be with a set pitch collection, it could be randomly. Um, yeah, and so that's sort of what happens. And if I'm writing an instrumental piece, I may have a form in mind that I want to use. Like for the harp concerto, I knew I wanted to use uh, sonata form, but the concerto version of sonata form that you find in Mozart and Beethoven concertos. And so I had an idea of what kinds of melodies I needed in different places of the form. And so I wrote those melodies first. So I knew like what the material was going to be. Um, yeah, so every piece is a little bit different in terms of like what the order of it is, but in general, there's a stage that is sort of exploratory. There's a stage where I'm writing a draft by hand on paper and I'm working at the piano. And then there's a stage where I take that and I input it into notation software in the computer. And in that process of inputting, I'll go and rewrite it or maybe add parts. Sometimes when I'm at the piano, like doing that part of it, or maybe I'm figuring out the chords and the melody, if it's a piece that has chords and melody, I may not actually flush out the instrumental or accompaniment part fully. I may just give myself cues, and then when I go into the notation software, I make all the decisions for the exact notes and rhythms, but based on the chords that I came up with in the draft. And so I always think of the handwritten score as a draft, and then putting it into notation software as another draft. And then I'll probably do a third draft once it's all in, just listening to it and playing it back. At that point, I may have to go back to the piano and find solutions for the problems that have come up. Maybe sections aren't connecting properly, or maybe I decide I don't like a section. I may have to go back then to with pencil and paper and find something.
That's really, really, really fascinating. As as you're speaking, I'm trying to apply what you're saying to what I've heard of your pieces. I tried to get through a lot of them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And what can you tell us about this I hope I pronounce it correctly. I'll have you pronounce it. The
Okay. La Virgen a solas.
Okay, without the S?
It should have the S, La Virgen a solas.
Okay. And
Uh,
it's almost sounds it's almost an SH sound, kind of Catalonian. La
I'm
Virgen.
not trying to do that. Maybe I'm just trying to over enunciate because it's Zoom.
Okay.
I'm afraid it'll get lost.
Okay.
Um, solas, solas, La Virgen a
Solas.
solas,
Solas. Okay.
solas. Yeah.
Well, what
Yeah.
can you tell us about the commission and how you came about with this spectacular piece?
So this is a really bizarre and kind of long and convoluted genesis. And it all started with my grandmother. She'd been taking piano lessons, which is ironic because her mother was a concert pianist, but she was also a very busy woman. She had like 8 or 9 kids, something like that. So you can imagine those piano lessons were not the most low-key affairs, right? My grandmother says that if you weren't perfectly practiced, you didn't even ask to play because you'd be afraid of making a mistake. And so she, none of the kids really did music from that generation, from my grandmother's generation. So when she was older, when she was like in her 50s or 60s, she decided to start playing piano. And at that point, I had already gone through music school, or I was in music school. And I was going down and doing little concerts with Celestiana de Guatemala. We were friends at that point, and we were going down and together and doing little shows for the family. And it's something that we did over several iterations. We did it when we were really young and still in music school. And we went back later when we were already professionals and took larger groups. At one point, we took a group of like 8 musicians down and did scenes from Madame Butterfly and other things in Guatemala. And to me, it was really important because of that history. I told you that my great grandparents were classical musicians, and all of their kids, who were still alive at that point for the most part, grew up with them in that capacity. But then nobody else took it up. And so it was like this way of reconnecting with their past. Now I was doing music and sort of taking up this thing 4 generations later that none of them had taken up and none of their kids had taken up. And so it was a big deal. And people would come. We'd get like lots of extended family come to the concerts, and a lot of them are, opera lovers and classical music lovers. And so it was really cool. In one of those visits, like I was saying, my grandmother had been taking piano lessons, and I decided to write a little piano piece for her based on some poetry that I found in this album. I was really into medieval music. Um, uh, I'd been taking my classes at UCSC, and there's this teacher up there. Her name's Lita Miller. She's now emeritus, I think. And she introduced me to lots of early music, and she had an early music ensemble, and she did history classes. And so I was really into that, and that was a big influence on me as a composer in those time periods. You can kind of hear that in the first movement of
Mhm.
Solas. Actually, it has a chant-like quality. So I had been collecting vinyl that I used to get downtown at Logos, back when Logos was still around in downtown Santa Cruz. It's now gone. And there was this series called History of Spanish Music. And in History of Spanish Music, there was this album that was a Christmas album, medieval Christmas music. And it had this text about the Virgin. And it says, we shouldn't sleep tonight because the Virgin's by herself and she's scared. And imagine what it would be like to be all by yourself in the middle of nowhere in the dark, nowhere to sleep, and you have to give birth to the Son of God. Like that, wouldn't that be scary? And so we shouldn't sleep either because she's not going to be able to sleep tonight. And so it's a Christmas song, but it was all about the Virgin Mary and her experience, which I found really fascinating. And in Guatemala, of course, as in most of Latin America, the Virgin is really, really important. And lots of people pray to the Virgin. My grandmother used to pray to the Virgin. Um, and And so I thought, oh, this is great. I'll take these words and I'll write a little tune that she can play and sing along, right? And so very simple left hand part, the melody's in the right hand, and then she can sing the words. So I took that down to her and we sang it for her and everybody cried. And Celestiana was there in that version. There was a very different version than the version that exists now because it was just very tonal, very common practice tonality. It sounded like a simple Schubert, like a Schubert song for kids, kind of what it sounded like. Um, and then later on, when this piece for Celestiana and organ came about, and then that's when I had the idea to take this initial little piece and sort of expand it out into a whole movement and and create it in a more in my style as opposed to in a tonal common practice style that I learned in school, but my own personal compositional style. And that became the last movement. And I went back to these texts to find texts for the first section. And so this is the section, um, you know, which is like, what, that God has become incarnate so that we may all be saved. And the Virgin said, please help me. I don't even have anything to wrap my kid in. And it's all these, once again, this other poem that was about the Virgin and her experience on Christmas, right? So that was sort of the original genesis of the piece. And then
Wow.
there's now been a later version because I edited it at one point, like 10 years ago. And then once you expressed interest in the piece, I revisited it and got inspired to add another movement. And I also created a version that has a choral part for SSA choir to sort of create that sort of back and forth between the choir and the soloist. And so it's become now this bigger thing. So yeah, it kind of continues to have a life of its own.
Wow. This is so amazing. So, yeah, this is so helpful, I think, for all of us to hear from the composer a little bit about your life and about what you're thinking, what's important to you, and how you present it. And thank you. This has
Yeah,
been
my pleasure.
a really wonderful to hear from you. And I can't wait to hear the piece performed at my concert on November 3rd. And I'll look forward to having you there so I can introduce you to everyone.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really an honor. I really enjoyed the concert you did last last time around when we first met, and it's just wonderful to have this opportunity. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. All right, Robin. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye.